Welcome to the Sports Umbrella, where we cover all aspects of sports. Soak in all the knowledge from our guests who range from pro athletes playing up a storm to industry experts making it rain. My name's Kelly Okun, and I'm a former pro golfer and founder and CEO of Fairway to Green, an equitable sports media company. Joining us this episode, presented by Galway Plus, is Craig Brown, the managing principal of the Galway Family Office. Craig dives into key distinctions between managing the wealth of athletes versus high net worth individuals and shares crucial notes for athletes and their families considering NIL deals. Craig, thank you so much for joining us today. Can you tell us a little bit about your athletic journey and what you're up to today?
Sure. Thanks for having me, first of all. My name is Craig Brown. A little bit interesting kind of career path for me. I started off, went to Tulane University on a full baseball scholarship. Really thought that baseball was going to be my path and my career. I had some really early success, played on the U.S. junior national team in 94, 95. And then, as I said, played at Tulane University, and then ultimately got drafted by the Cleveland Indians and played professionally with the Indians for a few years. And then from there, I realized pretty quickly that I was more of a roster filler than I was a prospect. And that was okay, because, it was an experience, that's something that I cherish, and certainly got an opportunity that many people don't. But realized pretty quickly that my life, or certainly from a financial standpoint, I wasn't going to earn enough trying to be a minor league baseball player. And I was in the right headspace always, going through school and really focused on my studies. So I had already graduated from Tulane, and then ultimately started working at Merrill Lynch as a wealth manager, financial advisor, and really started working kind of exclusively with athletes from the very beginning, more out of necessity than anything else. Traditionally in the financial services industry, you've got to eat what you kill, and so you have to go out and get your own clients. And so I had to figure out where I was going to try and find individuals to trust me with their money, and it seemed a little bit more logical that the demographic of high net worth individuals but slightly skewing younger with professional athletes was a little bit easier, at least from being able to relate with them. So really focused on recruiting baseball players just because it was something that I knew, and kind of that's been my path from there.
And how would you say being an athlete sort of helped you figure out how to get into this path or this career? Because I feel like so many athletes go into business, specifically finance, when they're done playing. Why does that translate so well?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. Most of the time you'll see teams, financial advisory teams, will bring on a former professional athlete. And really, I think a lot of it is due to the fact that they think that they have relationships, and it's going to be easier for them to get into rooms that they wouldn't have been able to get into, to knock down doors that they wouldn't be able to knock down. And I think that is a lot of the ways that many individuals have been able to go and have success. For me, it was a little bit different because, the majority of the people that I was approaching weren't necessarily, people that I had played with. I didn't have a ton of relationships with, Major League Baseball players. Number one, when I started working in the financial services field, I was 24. So, if you think about a Major League Baseball player, even if you did know people, they would have been very young, very early on. And, it's interesting at this, at this wonderful event that we're at here, one of my very first clients was a teammate of mine on the junior national team when we were 15 years old, David Ross. And, he was the one guy that kind of gave me confidence that, hey, I can go talk to these people who were, friends of mine and tell them what I'm doing and kind of explain, why I should be the person that's helping them. And, I owe him a lot because he took a chance and didn't have a ton of money then, but, whatever you've got, really matters to you. And so he took a chance on me and allowed me to work with him and help kind of guide his path. And we've been working together, going on 22 years now. So, that was a great experience. But it's a little bit different in my world, I think, because I wasn't, a major league player who had a lot of relationships or had name recognition with a bunch of people in Major League Baseball. But baseball did kind of teach me it's a sport where if you're failing 7 out of 10 times, then you're doing pretty dang good, and so you've got to have that perseverance, certainly in this space when it comes down to essentially getting someone to choose you, to say, hey, of all the people I can, entrust with my money, I'm going to choose you. If you think about it, you would think that the odds are pretty low that you're going to be the person who gets picked over and over again. So you've got to have that perseverance just to kind of stick with it.
Yeah, that's a lot of pressure, I'm sure, both on you and on the athletes.
Yeah.
When working with these athletes and managing their wealth, how is that different from a typical high net worth individual in your space?
Great question. And, I think it's a really important question because oftentimes you hear people talking about the fact that they specialize in working with professional athletes. And I've had families that I'm speaking to, tell me, oh, we're talking to this person or that person when they specialize in working with professional athletes. And I ask this question all the time, which is, well, what is it about a professional athlete that's so unique that makes it to where someone specializes or needs to specialize in working with them? And a lot of times, even when talking to wealth managers and asking that question, they're kind of stumped and perplexed by it. Because I think for many of them, it's the idea of, well, I want to work with these certain types of people because of the name recognition, the cool factor, things like that. But, I really kind of talk through this and harp on the fact that there are some unique things. Number one, they're all relatively young in age when they start earning this money. So there's a significant amount of financial literacy and education that you have to bring to them because they don't have this worldly kind of life experience to be able to draw upon. Number two, they're all going to be relatively extremely young in age when they retire from this place where they're typically going to earn their most significant wealth, which means that they're going to have an extended period of time in retirement. And that's very different than the average ultra high net worth person. You take the average person who's achieved significant wealth, and even outside of somebody in the kind of technology space where they've invented something or something like that, you're traditionally kind of looking at people who are older, who at least have had a less steep curve in terms of their wealth. It hasn't been this very steep trajectory. And so those individuals have a little bit more time to kind of understand what's happening, maybe screw up their first budget, and their first amount of money that they've earned. But with a professional athlete, it's very different. And so, being able to really think through the length of time that somebody is going to have in retirement and being able to plan for that, knowing that it's got to last, longer in retirement than you had during the time that you earned your money. Because if you think about it, an unbelievable career for a professional athlete, they're retiring at 35, 40 is really pushing it. And then you're talking about having 40 to 50 years in retirement that you've got to live off of that money. Then you've got inflation to think about. You've got all the reality that a lot of these individuals are just starting their families. And so it's not like that they're getting into the phase where they've got kind of, kids leaving their house and becoming empty nesters. They're actually gaining more expenses a lot of times going into retirement. So all these things are kind of factors that you have to deal with. And then the last piece is obviously it's dealing with the mentality of, you can't take people who are competitive by nature, okay, who have spent their whole life competing and being able to see a scorecard to see did they win or lose, and then take them out of that environment and say, oh, you've made a ton of money, just go sit on the couch or go fish or go do whatever and enjoy your hobbies and don't worry about doing anything else. That's not the case for professional athletes. And so helping to mentor and nurture and helping to guide through what is their 2.0 going to be is extremely important, because for many of these individuals, they want to start looking at other business ventures, and in the world of traditional wealth management, that is not necessarily great for the portfolio manager, for the investment advisor to have somebody wanting to devote their time, effort, and energy to other types of investments, because that means they're pulling money from their traditional investment portfolio and looking at investing it into things such as real estate or into a small business or into franchising and those types of things. And so a lot of times that advice and guidance that a traditional asset manager is giving is not the information that individual wants to hear, because there's a natural conflict of interest that kind of exists there. When one person is getting paid off of how much money you have in their accounts, and your client is saying they want to take that money from your account and put it into other things to scratch that itch for what they want to do professionally in their 2.0, that's problematic, which is why, I feel like the position that we're in a Galway Family Office is very different, because we don't invest any money for clients and we don't take any fees off some investments. So we're completely agnostic when it comes to how someone invests their money or where they invest their money. I always say we only care about making sure that our clients get the best risk-adjusted return that they possibly can, regardless of if that's, owning a bunch of vending machines, or if that's having a small business that they own, or if that's having a real estate portfolio, or having a traditional, portfolio in the capital markets. All of them are great opportunities, and typically it's some mixture of all of them. It's not, being myopic in view and saying it's one place only, but those are the things that really, to me, are the differentiators between people who have a real understanding of what it means to work with a professional athlete versus kind of the novelty or the sexiness of saying, oh, I work with this player or that player.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. It's so interesting. I always thought of athletes coming in young, but I never thought about them retiring at such a young age and how that shifts everything.
Yeah, it really does. Very much so.
Galway Plus is the proud sponsor of the Sports Umbrella. Galway Plus Sports and Entertainment is the first of its kind platform in the wealth and risk management sectors designed to cater to the diverse needs of affluent individuals, teams, leagues, and organizations operating within the sports and entertainment industries. Learn more at galwayplus.com. Do you find that you have to do a lot of convincing to help these athletes think about their long-term sustainability?
The hardest thing, I think, with anyone is to think about, worst case scenario. I think naturally most of us want to be optimistic and think that things are going to be okay. And what's really difficult is when you have a number that is sitting there in terms of the earnings that you're going to earn, and that number is so much greater than what you ever thought you would ever earn in your life. When you start stacking up your dreams that you've always had, and then you think about the money you thought you would make, you automatically assume that the money you thought you were going to make was enough to cover those dreams. And so now when you get a bigger number than you ever thought you were going to have, okay, the dreams don't just stay the same, they tend to rise as well. And so we always talk about the fact that you don't want to go backwards. You don't want to be in a position where you're going from flying private everywhere to suddenly you're sitting middle seat on the back of Spirit Airlines. So no offense to Spirit Airlines, they do a great job for a certain group of people, but it's very difficult to go backwards, to experience life a certain way and then have to deal with going and taking a step back for what you're able to afford to do. And so the goal is to really try and drive home the idea that you don't want to live in a way that is greater than what is realistic for you to be able to continue to live, And so what that means is you can't be in a position where you're living off of your salary. You've got to instead live off of the interest that your money is making you, because that will go on forever. That's perpetual, but your salary is definitely not perpetual, And so that's the hard part, is really kind of being dogmatic. And the number one thing you have to do is try and, it's like anything else. When we learn early on, hey, you got to brush your teeth every night, it becomes habitual that you just do it. If you can teach really good habits early on, it becomes habitual as well.
I love that. And going back to what athletes might want to invest in, probably after they're playing, but maybe sometimes near the second half of their careers, when they want to invest in sports or media or different startups, how do you approach that from an opportunity and risk standpoint, knowing the capital and the brand influence that they bring?
Yeah, so this is the new frontier, kind of the Wild West, because what you saw over the last, really, I'd really say it's really mostly based on when Golden State went on their run. And so you had all eyes on this really dynamic basketball team who happened to be in Silicon Valley, who happened to have all of these, ultra affluent, wealthy tech billionaires that are all fans. And then having those athletes then getting access to these individuals and having enough celebrity and notoriety because of their talents on the court to be able to get an audience with these individuals at a much higher frequency. That led to many of these athletes capitalizing on it and getting access to much more sought after private equity deals. I always say private equity, your only private equity firm or person who's bringing you deals are only as good as the deals that they have. Those individuals were able to get access to some really good deals. So that kind of spurred this thought process and this kind of revolution in the athlete space of wanting to really get heavily involved in investing in private equity and venture capital. And so with that becomes a greater risk that's there. I always look at it and see, you never really see someone who's doing a raise from the private equity side asking an individual who wants to invest, well, how much can you afford to put into this deal, right? They look at it and say, that's left for whoever is the person dealing with that side. We're doing a raise for this deal. And so one of the things that really has to be stressed is, how much money do you actually have to devote to private equity? Do you have to devote to alternative investments? And really that comes with the idea of really having, a core fundamental knowledge of what your asset allocation is and what it should be. And how does the private equity world, the alternative space, fit into your private equity model? And so the other part of that is the fact that these deals are coming as one-off deals all the time, And so I often find where you'll see many times where you'll see a player who, first quarter, they've spent their full allocation of what they potentially have to invest in private equity because they saw 3 deals and they loved those 3 deals. Well, guess what? That's all the money you really have to devote to private equity. And so 9 months later, throughout the rest of the year, there's more opportunities that are coming in. It's like, oh, I really want to get into this and I really want to get into that. And that's where you end up in a position where you're either going to be overexposed and have too much private equity in your portfolio, or you're going to miss out on deals because you haven't looked at it as a totality and say, this is how much I have to devote, regardless of whether they're all coming in the first quarter or if they're coming throughout the year.
I think your clients are very lucky to have you. It's very strategic. I love it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Are there any sort of legal or educational or cultural structures that are most effective in helping these athletes make good decisions?
Yeah, so, when I was introducing the panel yesterday and talking about the changes and things that are going on with NIL, one of the things that's happening as a byproduct of NIL across all of sports is that the age for where families are being forced to seek out financial advice and guidance is getting lower, because it used to be, if you were a football player, you had to play, you had to be 3 years removed from high school before you could turn pro. And so you're knowing that you've at least got, 21-year-olds before they're going to start thinking about this money that they're going to earn in the pros, okay? The only time you really had it going lower than that was in baseball because they could get drafted out of high school, and hockey, same kind of situation. Well, now with NIL, you're having kids who are 14, 15 years old, and not even those kids, but their families having to make decisions, and very impactful decisions about, do they take this money to go to this place, or do they take less money for what might be a better long-term opportunity in the future? Those are difficult decisions to make when you look at it, and if you look statistically at the individuals who are playing in professional sports across the 3 major sports, there is certainly, especially when you look at basketball and football, there's a disproportionate number of those individuals who come from impoverished backgrounds. And you're dealing with families who are, even at the NIL level, with the hundreds of thousands of dollars that many of these young men and women are making, to let alone the millions of dollars that some of them are making, having to make decisions, that are really based on this monetary number that's put out there to them that, we don't have nearly the kind of historical reference points to be able to look back on and say, okay, well, this is the right way to do this or to do that. So there's a lot of people that are really just out there kind of feeling it out right now. But the number one thing I always say is, everyone gets to decide if you want to invest your money, okay? And if you do decide you want to invest your money, you get to decide how you want to invest your money. You can, I like to use the example of, you think about cars, you can have a tricycle, and you know how fast that goes, and you're probably not going to get hurt with that. That's like a CD, treasury bills, You could have a high performance sports car. That's like investing in small cap stocks, or private equity, alternative investments. So you've got this gambit of investment options that you can make. And everyone gets to make that decision based on their risk tolerance and other factors. What you don't get to decide is whether or not you're going to pay your taxes. And that is the thing that, to me, is the most scary about the current state of sports and this new world of NIL, is the fact that every one of these young men and women are getting paid gross. There are no taxes withheld, not a dollar. And if you think about it, going back to the statement I made earlier about a disproportionate number of these young men and women are coming from familial backgrounds where mom and dad probably are used to getting a tax refund check as opposed to having to pay additional taxes in, that now they go from that scenario to being in a situation where every single one of these individuals has to pay taxes, and they have to set that money aside themselves. And when you think about the idea of a young man or a young woman who's getting $250,000 of NIL, and they're getting no advice and guidance from the universities and saying, based off of this number, this is what your projected amount you're going to owe in taxes are, so you need to make sure you have that set aside. They're not getting that information. And that's the scary thing, because what you're going to have is, statistics will tell you that the majority of these young men and women will not play professionally and will go and get a regular 9-to-5 job. Most of them will go in making less than what they made off of this money that they were earning in NIL, at least early on. And they're potentially going to be saddled with a tax burden that is compounding on them, because until they pay it, it's going to be, the amount that they owe is going to be compounded. So those are the things that really, for me, are kind of where I want to kind of stand on my soapbox and shout at the rooftops and say, like, everybody needs to pay attention to this.
Yeah, I feel like that's something that's not talked about enough at all. It's about how do you get the deals, not how do you manage them financially afterwards.
Well, that's where all the money is, right? Because, if you think about it, and that's the other thing, a lot of people don't understand with NIL is that, when you're signing with a professional sports league, they've collectively bargained those contracts with the agents. So when you sign with whatever agent it is for your contract with the team, that contract is standard language, that everybody is signing the same contract. The percentage that you may write in there for, if that's negotiated with your agent, might be different, but all the other language is the same. On the marketing side, there is no standard contract. And the person who's putting the contract together is the agent. And so that contract is always going to skew more towards benefiting them than it is the player. That's just a natural thing. And so when you look at this, and because it's so new with NIL, you're seeing some people charging, it started off where people were charging 0%. And, we don't charge for NIL. Then it turned into, okay, people are charging 5%, 7%, 7.5%, 10%, 15%, 20%. There's such a huge spectrum, and so unfortunately, you're getting some kids who are paying significantly more than others, not because of the quality of work that's being done, just because of the lack of knowledge and the lack of kind of standardization of that space. So that's another thing that's really interesting.
Yeah, and NIL is so volatile right now, but do you foresee regulations coming soon to help remedy some of that?
We were having a conversation about this last night. I think the regulations that are coming are really, they're more to protect the institutions than they are to protect the student athletes.
Yeah.
When you look at the house settlement and things like that, the whole reason for house settlement was because of antitrust, right? And not allowing these athletes to earn off of what is theirs, their name, image, and likeness. And now what is being proposed is to say, okay, we'll let you earn, but we're going to cap what you can earn, And to me, it's a way of saying, we let the toothpaste out of the tube. We've got to figure out a way, we can't put it back in, so let's figure out a way to at least corral the toothpaste and make it to where it's only a certain amount that's allowed to come out every year. And I hope that, these young men and women continue to be vigilant and fight for what is rightfully theirs. Ultimately, there will be some sort of kind of meeting of the minds, and it will settle into a place. But I think the pendulum tends to swing in a violent way in one direction, and it has an equally violent swing in the opposite direction as a counterattack to that initial swing. And I think that's what we're seeing now. But what's interesting is, you still got a need for self-preservation for these coaches at these universities to win. And so they're going to do what they need to do in order to win, as it's always been.
Craig, thank you so much for such an insightful conversation. That was super interesting.
Thank you.
Really appreciate you coming on today.
Appreciate you having me. Look forward to doing it again, Nick.
I hope so. Thank you.
Thanks, Kelly.